manipulating people.
And manipulating people, but also generative AI can manipulate the manipulators.
It can. I mean, there's many layers of manipulation that are possible, and I think we don't yet really understand the consequences. Dan Dennett just sent me a manuscript last night that will be in the Atlantic in a few days on what he calls counterfeit people. It's a wonderful metaphor. These systems are almost like counterfeit people, and we don't really honestly understand what the consequence of that is. They're not perfectly human-like yet, but they're good enough to fool a lot of the people a lot of the time.
Folks, welcome back to MLST. Today is an incredibly special episode because I got to interview another one of my heroes. Doesn't happen very often. I mean, my God, a year ago it was Noam Chomsky, and now it is Professor Daniel Dennett. He is easily the most famous and well-known philosopher alive today. I just can't get my head around how I managed to pull this thing off. I was implementing the winging it methodology. I saw Professor Gary Marcus talk about Dennett's new paper that we're going to talk about at the Senate meeting a few weeks ago. I slowly reached for the keyboard. I started typing Dennett's email address. The words came out. I pressed the send button. Minutes later, Professor Dennett replied, I'm not going to detain us too long on this particular thing, but basically he said yes. And this was an opportunity that I was going to capitalize on because Dennett is my hero. He is an absolute living legend. So this is going to go down. This is one of those things that I can tell my grandchildren about. Anyway, enough of all of that. Let's carry on with the show. So, Professor Daniel Dennett has just published an article in The Atlantic called Counterfeit People. He said in that article, creating counterfeit digital people risks destroying our civilization. Democracy depends on the informed, not misinformed consent of the governed. By allowing the most economically and politically powerful people, corporations, and governments to control our attention, these systems will control us. Counterfeit people, by distracting and confusing us, and by exploiting our most irresistible fears and anxieties, will lead us into temptation, and from there into acquiescing to our own subjugation. The counterfeit people will talk us into adopting policies and convictions that will make us vulnerable to yet more manipulation, or will simply turn off our attention and become passive and ignorant pawns. This is a terrifying prospect. Dennett spoke about anthropomorphizing large language models. Now, he thinks that they don't have agency at the moment, although he doesn't think they have zero agency. But he thinks that we shouldn't anthropomorphize them and we should be wary of ascribing agency to them when architecturally they don't have a significant amount of agentiveness. Although interestingly, Dennett does think that this is just an architectural configuration. There's no reason in principle why they couldn't be configured to have more agency. On that note, Dennett signed the AI risk letter. That letter was very short. It said mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority, alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. The first of which is the intentional stance. So this is a concept which was developed by Professor Daniel Dennett, and it refers to a perspective or strategy in which we interpret the behavior or actions of a system, such as a person, an animal, or even a machine, by attributing intentions, beliefs, desires, or other psychological states to it. Now, in this approach, we predict and explain the system's behavior by assuming it has goals or desires, which is to say, the system's actions aim to achieve specific outcomes. Also, beliefs. The system has a mental representation of the world which guides its actions based on those beliefs. And finally, rationality. The system acts rationally according to its beliefs and desires to achieve its goals. So the intentional stance works as a heuristic or explanatory framework to make sense of the complex behavior of such systems. Now, Dennett proposed 3 stances to understand and predict the behavior of a system. The physical stance explains the behavior based on the physical laws governing the system, like the laws of physics or chemistry or biology. There's also the design stance, which focuses on the intended purpose or function of the system, often in terms of its engineering or design principles. And finally, the intentional stance, which attributes intentions, beliefs, and desires to the system to explain its behavior. Now, another really important concept I wanted to speak about is the knowledge argument, which comes up all the time in philosophy of mind discussions. It was originally proposed by Frank Jackson, and it goes as follows. Mary is a brilliant scientist who is, for whatever reason, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, or use terms like red and blue and green and so on. So what happens when Mary is released from her black and white room? Does she learn anything new or not? Well, Jackson claims that she does. Mary's room is a thought experiment which attempts to establish that there are non-physical properties and attainable knowledge that can be discovered only through conscious experience. It attempts to refute the theory that all knowledge is physical knowledge. Professor Dennett also gave me privileged access to his new draft paper on cherry picking, which you can think of as a very similar concept to exploration, creativity, and even experimentation. Dennett said that cherry picking, or selecting the best results, is a crucial aspect of decision making, creativity, and invention. Both humans and AI systems like GPT cherry pick, but in different ways. With GPT, he says, cherry picking occurs during the training process and the fine-tuning stages. He also said that conscious human invention relies on generating numerous options and selecting the best ones. A bit like that tree of thought paper from DeepMind. Do you remember that? It's basically an A-star search over prompt trajectories, using the language model itself as a value function. So yeah, we're increasingly seeing models trained on trajectories of reasoning paths as a first-class citizen rather than actual answers, so that we know that they predict the right things for the right reasons and we can better understand their reasoning process. Now, Dennett also said that cherry-picking processes are present in both an individual's consciousness and the communication practices. And he said that there's resistance to accepting the interpersonal nature of cherry-picking processes in creating our consciousness. He pointed out that the Eliza effect demonstrates our instinct to discover interpretations, and that to make AI capable of speech acts, it must cherry-pick its own outputs with autonomy. He concluded that creating conscious autonomous AI might be dangerous and could conflict with human interests. Anyway, this brings us back full circle to Counterfeit People. Now, he said that AI should be used for smart machines, not artificial colleagues, and that preventing counterfeit AI individuals is crucial for societal trust and security. He said that legal and technological barriers are needed to protect against the dangers of counterfeit AI creations. Anyway, with that said, I hope you enjoy the show today. It's been an honour to interview Professor Dennett. Enjoy. Welcome back to MLST, ladies and gentlemen. We are here today with Professor Daniel Dennett, an American philosopher, writer, and cognitive scientist whose research primarily focuses on the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and philosophy of biology, particularly as those fields relate to evolutionary biology and cognitive science. Now, Dennett is in fact arguably the most famous and important living philosopher today, and given our particular interest in the philosophy of mind, can you only imagine how excited we are for this opportunity? Dennett also did his PhD under the legendary Gilbert Ryle, who coined the term the ghost in the machine, which we've spoken about at great length recently, particularly with respect to Noam Chomsky. He's very well known in many adjacent fields of science, but today we're going to be focusing on the theory of mind and ethics. Now, Dennett is a strong advocate of a naturalistic and materialistic approach to understanding the mind and consciousness, and he's also known for arguing that conscious experiences are essentially the result of complex computations carried out by the brain, which is to say he's a computationalist. You might say that his arch intellectual nemesis is John Searle. Now, one of his central theories is the multiple drafts model of consciousness, which suggests that there is no single unified stream of consciousness, but rather a series of parallel processes occurring in the brain, which gives rise to our subjective experience. Now, throughout his career, Dennett has written several influential and popular books on various topics related to philosophy, cognitive science, and evolution. And some of his notable works include Content and Consciousness, The Intentional Stance, Consciousness Explained, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Freedom Evolves, and From Bacteria to Bark and Back, The Evolution of Minds. Now, Dennett is currently Professor of Philosophy and co-director of the Center of Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. He continues to be an influential thinker and public intellectual, contributing to various debates surrounding the mind, evolution, and the role of religion in our society. Now, Professor Dennett has just published an article in The Atlantic titled "The Problem with Counterfeit People." He argued that companies using AI to generate fake people are committing an immoral act of vandalism and should be held liable. Now, Nick from our Discord community expressed it as a continued degradation of social and ontological coherence in a world mediated by software, effectively Goodhart's law reified in ever more facets of our lives. Professor Dennett, it's an absolute honor to have you here. Could you tell us about your article?
I've been writing increasingly urgent warnings about the dangers of certain trends in AI. And the one in the Atlantic is meant to really ring the alarm bell. LLMs, chatbots, ChatGPT, and their kin are, I think, an extraordinarily dangerous turn in the technology because they're good enough to fool people. They are good counterfeits of actual interlocutors. And since we're spending so much of our time online these days, we're getting so much of our interactions with people online, we're suckers for fake people online. It's almost impossible. It is impossible now to create a fake person that whose hand you can shake and whose perfume you can smell and so forth. But virtual people, you on your end of the internet now and me on mine, it's becoming more and more possible to fake those. And what a lot of people don't seem to realize is that as this becomes more a part of our reality, as more and more of these fakes populate the virtual world, it's going to change our whole attitude about what we're doing right now. And we're going to become less trustful. We're going to become worried about whether we're talking to the real thing or something else. And either we're going to get paranoid and start asking gotcha questions all the time, trying to check each other out to see if we're real, or we're just going to ignore each other pretty much, and we're going to lose the very connectivity that we've just recently gained thanks to the internet. I think the prospect of harm, serious harm to the fabric of civilization is right here. And it's not because AGI is going to enslave us. It's that we're going to let much, much, much stupider systems beguile us and manipulate us and generally devalue the world of communication.
Yes, indeed. In many ways, undermining our weaknesses rather than overcoming our strengths. But
Yes.
I wanted to pick up on something about reversibility. Now, you said in your article that it will soon be next to impossible to tell whether text has been generated by a human or not. And even if for the time being we're able to teach one another reliable methods of exposing counterfeit people, the cost of such deepfakes to human trust will be enormous. Now, I spoke with Professor Luciano Floridi recently, and he discussed this concept of reversibility. He said, when you come to my house and you find clean dishes on the table, did I do the dishes? Did the dishwasher do the dishes? I don't know, he said. And he defined reversibility as, from the answer, I can reverse to the actual identity of the source. An irreversible process is one which doesn't let you do that. And he argued that language models are becoming more irreversible by the day, as you do, which is to say they're making fewer obvious mistakes, although a tangential issue is whether they have the capacity to deceive us. I think we'll touch on that later. But on the other side could be a human, a group of humans, a human with a computer, or ChatGPT. What's your take?
Well, I think right now we're still fairly secure. I'm not seriously worried that I'm not talking to you and that you are a reasonable, communicative, and constructive interlocutor. But that may change. The point is, it could change. And if bad actors and just thoughtless actors thinking they're having a lark make it change, they'll do a lot of damage. I was struck by a phrase in a video lecture by Eric Horvitz, the chief scientific officer at Microsoft, who spoke about the post-epistemic world. And that's a chilling thought. No sooner do we create this wonderful method of sending information around the world, that we also invent methods of sending misinformation around the world that we can't tell from information, and we pollute our own extended nervous systems. You don't have. We often say, "Well, are my eyes deceiving me? Are my ears deceiving me?" But we know that neither our eyes nor our ears, as it were, have ulterior motives. If they're deceiving us, it's because of minor flaws in their design that have been tripped by some illusions in the external world. But we're now entering an age where deception is much more technically possible. And of course, when it's technically possible, there are going to be people who mindlessly use that possibility to do all sorts of stunts, some of which may be really damaging. I think it's the philosopher Kim Sterelny who writes about thought in a hostile world, who says basically we can trust our eyes and our ears because we're all in the same boat. Our eyes and our ears. It does not serve any useful purpose for our eyes willfully to deceive us. Our eyes often do help us see things that are important to us that we wouldn't otherwise see, which is great. Evolution has done a wonderful job of making our information facilities tuned to the things that matter most to our survival and well-being. That's a story in itself. But we're now challenging that wonderful arrangement with all our technology, which can get out of our control.
Yes, I completely agree about the epistemic deterioration. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about ontological deterioration. But I think something we'll touch on as well is the extent to which these systems are autonomous, whether they have agency or whether they are tools. And if they do have agency, can they deceive us? Because I think there's a difference between a counterfeit human and a counterfeit human with goals and desires and intentionality and so on. But just coming on to this point about reontologization, which I think is very interesting. So again, Luciano Floridi said that once digital immigrants like us are replaced by digital natives like our children, the emigration will become complete and future generations will increasingly feel deprived, excluded and handicapped or poor whenever they're disconnected from the infosphere like fish out of water. And he said that these technologies like GPT are reontologizing, which is a more extreme form of re-engineering us and our society, which is to say our intrinsic nature is being transformed. He argued that it's modifying our everyday perspective on the ultimate nature of reality, so our metaphysics from a materialistic one where objects and processes play a role to an informational one. So, I mean, do you agree in principle with this idea of reontologization?
I'm not sure. It sounds a little extreme, but I don't know for sure what Floridi had in mind. I think that on the positive side, the new technology is helping people understand something that I've been stressing for years, namely that our native equipment has been designed by evolution to create a sort of benign user illusion. The affordances, to use James Gibson's wonderful term, the affordances that we just take for granted and pick up, and every child learns in the course of the first couple of years of life, we can now more easily see that our affordances are already biased by our senses, tuned to us. So, are colors real? In one sense, yeah, of course they're real. Of course they're real. We aren't going to sue Sherwin-Williams Paint Company for false advertising when they tell us they've got paint in many different colors. Of course they do. Color is as real as the chips in the paint store. On the other hand, you can't characterize color independently of color perceivers. Color is a phenomenon which requires both generators and consumers. In effect, it requires a particular sort of a user. And if you're colorblind, you're a different sort of user than if you aren't. And if you were a tetrachromat like a pigeon, you'd be able to see colors that you and I can't see. And those colors are just as real. They're just not visible to us. And they're not independent of their perceivers.
I wanted.
Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to ask you actually about this dichotomy between, realists like John Searle and representationalists, because I think color perception is a great example of that. John Searle would say when you tie up your shoes, that really happened, and that the things that we perceive are actually in reality. And then you have people like Kant who say the thing in itself, which is this idea that humans can't know the world directly, can only know it through representations and experiences. And of course, Hume and Berkeley thought that objects were collections of experiences, like a phenomenological understanding. But so you are a realist, is that fair?
I'm a realist about real patterns.
Okay.
The same year that I published Consciousness Explained, I published a paper called Real Patterns, which has taken on a life of its own in the sciences mainly. And I say what's real is any pattern in the data that you can bet on and make money on it. It's any pattern which is distinguishable from randomness, better, more compressed than the bitmap, and that's what reality is. And the idea that there's a deeper reality, I guess Kant would be a good example of the most worked out version of that. I've always found that to be a bit of inflation. Philosophers love to inflate things, and I'm usually a deflationist. I think a lot of people think we don't have free will because, as Jerry Fodor once said, we want to be so free that even God couldn't tell whether Eve was going to bite into the apple. No, we don't care about that. Nor should we. We want to be as unpredictable as we have to be so that we can't be manipulated by others. And we want to keep our cards close to our chest. We don't want to have tells, as a poker player would say. We want to reserve our planning and our sense of what the options are and what we know and what we don't know. We want to reserve that to ourselves. That's what our autonomy depends on, and that's what our free will depends on. But philosophers often want to think that the way to get to the root of the thing is to go extreme, to become absolutists of one sort or another, and then to wring their hands about it.
I hadn't really thought about this, but it's maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but it seems a bit like you're saying there's an existential imperative to be unpredictable. And maybe one of the problems with large language models being able to predict us with such high fidelity is it kind of erodes our autonomy because there's this adversarial actor out there who knows what we're going to do.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in those terms too. But of course, you and I are able to have this conversation because we're pretty good at predicting the next word out of my what?
Your mouth?
Yes, of course. I was hoping you were going to jump in there a little faster. Husbands and wives can often finish each other's sentences.
Indeed.
That's not a bad thing. That's what brains are for. It's for predicting. And we'd be hopelessly out of the loop if we weren't engaged in, one might even say, aggressive anticipation all the time. We don't have to worry about it. It takes care of itself. It's part of our automatic brain functioning. And autonomy is, in large measure, a matter of keeping the highest levels of your motivational systems to yourself and exploiting deterministic chaos. Like basically, it's good to have coin flippers in your head, and for a very, very simple reason, for the same reason that computers have randomizers and call for random variables a lot. And the reason they do is when you don't know what to do, you don't want to be stuck like Bearden's ass, frozen between eating and drinking because you're both hungry and thirsty. You flip a coin. And we need randomness in that watered down sense. It's not quantum randomness. It's not indeterminism. It's just a source of bits that's orthogonal to or independent of whatever it is that we're thinking about. That's the basis for statistical design of experiments in science. and it's how we choose the next words out of our mouths. We in one of my books, I tell the tale of myself when I was in grade school and learned how to do long division, and was initially shocked when the teacher said, "You want to know how many times 379 goes into 2,000,006? What do you put down for your first?" She said, "Just guess. Just randomly guess. Blurt it out, and then you test. And if it's too much, you change your guess. If it's too little, you change your guess." That random step in long division is a perfect model of something we have to do and that our brains do all the time. We're doing it right now, in your brain right now.
Well,
I'm going to say, just for fun, thousands of possible continuations of this discussion are unconsciously trying to get themselves into the conversation right now. And now when I let you talk, what comes out is going to be something that's won a competition in an partially chaotic opponent process.
Well, so I think because you're slightly touching on your cherry picking draft, and we can talk about that in a minute, but that's somewhat analogous to exploration. And I also want, because I know you're a famous philosopher of science as well, and in my mind, science is about generating intelligible explanations about things. And you were just talking. Yep, and I think you were just talking about what I would call abduction, which is about kind of like creating a plausible hypothesis space. That's the really mysterious part. And then we do the strong and the weak syllogisms where we do deduction and induction. A lot of people don't talk about the abduction part. But I also wanted to talk about what you were saying before. So prediction is this kind of continuum. And you could be a complete empiricist, a blank slate person, and you're just looking at raw sensory information. But even with your long division example, there was this flash of inspiration, or maybe you were given the knowledge or you acquired the knowledge of the structure of how to perform that reasoning. And then suddenly the way your cognition handled that problem was changed dramatically. And it's very similar to Noam Chomsky being a rationalist. He thinks that we have this structure kind of built into us, and it would be impossible to think without the structure. So, yeah, how much structure do we need?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, let me reflect on Noam Chomsky for just a moment. Maybe that will bring my thinking into better focus on this. Yes, Noam is an ardent rationalist, and he seems not to appreciate that rationalism, taken neat, the way he seems to want to take it, Descartes' one, is it's a dead end. And actually, Descartes figured this out. Descartes, in the Meditations, realizes that he's going to need a non-deceiving God to guarantee his clear and distinct ideas, his rationalistic structure. If God's deceiving him, he's in deep trouble, and so he has to cook up these preposterous arguments for the existence of God, just in order to satisfy himself that he can trust his own thought. On the other side, there's those of us who believe that this is not a solitary venture; it's a communal venture. And I trust my thought to some degree, but I trust your thought to some degree, and I am willing to have you offer suggestions that will correct what I'm saying. And this process of mutual constructive discussion is the best way we have to get clear about truth. An old friend of mine, Roger Wertheimer, once wrote about what he called the factu-norm principle. Factu-norm is not a very friendly term, but that's what he called it. And that's the very business of talking to each other as we're doing now, presupposes that we think we know that this is a way to get at the truth. Otherwise, why do we do it? We go play tennis or something like that. There'd be no point in having this discussion if we didn't think that how we do carry on discussion is also normative. That's how we ought to do it. But of course, that's a correctable process. It's defeasible. We can learn new methods. We can change our logical system. We can discover irrational numbers and imaginary numbers like I, and the process of invention grows out of this churn of interaction with other thinkers. And Noam seems to think that he wants to be a Cartesian, and I want to be a Darwinian. And I think that's a really fundamental divide. Once you get on to Darwin, you realize that the Cartesian route is a brilliant dead end. The other day, I was talking with somebody about this, and I put forward the sort of rude thought that Descartes has the honor of having been, in a way, the wrongest thinker ever. His Principia inspired Newton, who thought Descartes was just dead wrong. And of course, Descartes was just dead wrong in his physics and Newton. But Descartes inspired Newton to come up with Newtonian physics. Descartes is also dead wrong in a way that Darwin corrected. So without Descartes, we might not have had Newton and Darwin, who I think are the two greatest thinkers of all time.
Just before we leave this topic, I mean, of course, you were supervised by Gilbert Ryle, who coined the term "the ghost in the machine," who's very famous for criticizing Descartes, actually. And
Yeah.
I'm sure he had a huge inspiration on, inspired a lot of your thought as well. But I just wondered if you could just give me a few comments on what that was like.
What Gilbert Ryle and our interactions was like, yes.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I go into this in more detail in my forthcoming memoir called I've Been Thinking, which will be out in the fall. But I confess that, first of all, Ryle was a hero of mine already when I was an undergraduate. I thought The Concept of Mind was maybe the best philosophy book I'd ever read. So I was very thrilled to be working with Ryle. But then when I met him, I was initially frustrated to discover I couldn't get him to argue with me. It was like punching a pillow. I'd try to pick a fight, and he'd say, "Oh, yes, yeah, yes," and he'd offer a few examples. And he just, I guess, in a couple of years working with him, he sort of cured me of the philosopher's combativeness and gave me a model of constructive thinking. But I didn't appreciate it at the time. And when my fellow graduate students asked me what it was like to work with Ryle, I said, well, he's great at cheering me up and egging me on, and I'll go to see him and I'll be all crestfallen and thinking I should get out of the field, and come out of his study thinking, okay, I can do this, I can do this. But I don't think I've learned anything from him. And then I looked at a draft of my dissertation that I'd written early, and then I looked at the draft that I handed in. And Ryle's fingerprints were all over that. He'd had a tremendous, but almost subliminal influence on my thinking.
Interesting. Do you think that the combativeness in science, or maybe in philosophy, is a bit like the learning rate in a neural network? It increases the velocity of learning, or do you think it's somewhat orthogonal to that?
Oh, I think combativeness is required, but there's combativeness, and then there's just pugilism. And I call it fisticuffs, and I spell it with a PH. And that's what a lot of philosophers' whole careers are, just fisticuffs. And I really have very little patience for that. Define your terms, sir. And I've got a counterexample. What a lot of philosophers call a theory, I call a slogan. That's all it is. It's a refined counterexample proof slogan. And the only tests it's ever passed is that nobody can think of a counterexample to it. That's not the way to make progress. But absolutely, competition is required. Think of Andrew Wiles' proof of Fermat's last theorem. For hundreds of years, people have thought they'd proved Fermat's last theorem. But those who thought so were mainly somewhat deranged. They were going crazy. If you think you've proved Fermat's last theorem, you've got to consider the disjunction. Either I have proved Fermat's last theorem or I'm going crazy. And you have to take the second conjunct very seriously. The only thing that could or should convince Andrew Wiles that he'd succeeded was that his fellow mathematicians, his competitors, graciously conceded after pouring untold hours of oppositional work into seeing if they could find any flaws in his proof. That's how you do science. That's how you do mathematics, even mathematics. We have to remember that there's a social side to mathematics. Nobody would trust arithmetic if we didn't have all the experience of it being used to count cows and apples and to balance your checkbook. It works. It works. The empirical evidence that arithmetic works is, in the end, what really grounds our conviction in it, not any proofs about the about the consistency of arithmetic.
I wanted to move over to your two black boxes thought experiment. Would you mind just briefly framing it up, and then we'll go from there?
Yes, this thought experiment was designed to show, in a way, the ineliminability of the intentional stance, or the practical necessity of using it. So I imagine that we find these two black boxes, box A and box B, and they're connected with a wire. I'm going to keep this comically simple. There's a few buttons, two buttons on box A and three lights on box B. You press button A, alpha on box A, and box B thereupon either shines a red light or a green light, or very occasionally an amber light. And the scientists want to figure out, they run a few billion trials, and they figure out that whatever the cause of the lights going on box B, it's coming through this wire. If you cut the wire, of course it doesn't. There's no interaction anymore. But when they look at what's in the wire, it's a bit string. I can't remember how long I said in my original thought that bit string was, but some thousands of bits. And then they look in the boxes and they find that each one has a program in it. They're computers, but they're different computers. Their hardware is different. Their software is different. And and we can suppose that absent any manuals, these are quite inscrutable to the computer scientists. But they check, and when they had the whole thing all set up underneath, everybody agrees, tracing through at the micro level, that the cause of the green light going on or the red light going on is determined in no magical way, just by everyday hand simulation of the flip-flops and so forth all the way through. So there's no mystery here. There's no morphic resonances or spiritual interventions. Well, then finally they find out how the thing works. These are GoFi systems. At the time I wrote it, LLMs didn't exist, weren't even really imagined. So they're boxes of truths. They're boxes of world knowledge. Box A might be inspired by Doug Lennett's Psych project of many years ago to try to encode everyday world knowledge in a program by hand coding. And in any case, these are two independent efforts to create a box of truth. And what's being passed down the wire is just the signal, send a true sentence down the wire. If you push the red button or the A button, send a falsehood down. And those falsehoods or truths are pulled by the randomizer out of the box. So if you push the true button on box A, maybe it'll say Cincinnati is a city in Ohio. That's true. And if you have asked for a false sentence, it might say giraffes are a kind of fish. That's all. And the other box simply tests for truth or falsehood against its own box of truth. But otherwise, the systems are as distinct as you could make them. Now, what I claim is you have to go to the semantic level to understand how this system works. You have to have the concepts of meaning and truth reference. When I first trotted this experiment out at a conference at Santa Fe Institute, Danny Hillis, my old friend, was there, and he said, "Oh, I get it." He said that this is cryptography using the world as a one-time pad. And that's exactly right. The reality of semantics is, if you've got it, you can predict like a son of a gun in many circumstances very easily by adopting the intentional stance and treating these things as passing information on various topics in the world. It works. The patterns are real. They may be entirely inscrutable at lower levels. If you want to understand the stock market, don't go to the level of microphysics and try to trace it through the brains of all the players, all the stockbrokers in the world. Much better off to treat them as agents with beliefs and desires, and then you'll be able to make some prophecies which are way better than chance coming out.
And I'm sorry if this seems like a ridiculous distinction, but using the model of beliefs and desires is presumably different to thinking they have beliefs and desires.
Not much. Not much.
How much?
Here's where my Darwinian gradualism, as usual, comes in. Actually, one of the inspirations for my intentional stance was when the computer programmer Rich Greenblatt, we were at the AI lab at MIT, and he said of a chess playing program, early chess playing program, it thinks it should get its queen out early. And everybody in the room understood what he meant, and everybody realized there was no sentence in any language in that program which you would translate as, I should get my queen out early, or anything like that. It believes, but the sense in which the chess program believed it should get its queen out early is pretty much the same sense that you believe a lot of things that you believe. I mean, one of the things that you believe is that zebras in the wild don't wear hats. I haven't told you anything you didn't already know. Do you think that belief was encoded in your head? No. But it's simply part of your world knowledge that you know that. You don't know when you learned it. Nobody told you. And most of the information that guides our everyday life occupies that kind of role in our brains. We do, of course, learn things by being told things. Here's where we get closer to GPT. Language is what opens up the unbelievable wealth of knowledge that anybody in the world now can share. But it all rests on this more animal foundation of information about the world, which is the information we need to take care of ourselves.
Interesting. Okay. A few things on that then. There's knowledge and there's syntax, and as Searle said, some knowledge is epistemically subjective, like economics. And you were talking about chess, which is very interesting because I know as a philosopher, you're incredibly well known for thinking about how purpose and intentionality and meaning arises. And I actually asked my friend Professor Mark Bishop for comment on some of this stuff. He found a comment online actually about your black box thought experiment by a professional philosopher, and they said that it showed how the properties red, green, and amber weren't really semantical or mentalistic after all, but only imitation semantical properties, as if semantical properties, basically very complicated, meaningless syntactical properties. And then you responded, why draw such a distinction? But the main thrust, though, where I want to go with this is this idea of the meaning of computation being observer relative. So there was an example from, I think, Winograd and Flores. They used a chess computer, which can play chess, and they used it to control lights in an art exhibition. So, Mark would say it's meaningless until put to human use, when it's plugged into the wider cognitive ecology of where the machines play a part that imbues the meaning. What do you think about that?
I think it's anthropocentric in an indefensible way. Let's take an example which is deliberately very simple. Let's think about Batesian mimicry, and let's think that there's a poisonous snake that has a bright red band. I can't remember the names of the snakes. Bright red band around its neck, which is very important because its poisonousness wouldn't help it if it wasn't notoriously poisonous. And this is its warning that it's poisonous. And then there's other species of snake which also have a red band on theirs, and they're parasitic on the first. They mimic the poisonous variety, um, uh, and get a fitness benefit from being close to indistinguishable from the poisonous variety. So they're freeloading on the poison generating capacity of the poisonous species. Now, is there semantics there? Yeah, of course. If you want to make sense, of that, if you imagine, a Martian just finding these two snakes in the world and seeing they both have a red stripe, and you ask, why? Why? Well, that question is ambiguous. There's a how come asking, and there's a what for. I go into that in a lot more detail in From Bacteria to Bach and Back. The how come explanation would require an account of millions of years of evolution. The what for explanation cuts to the chase and says what I just told you, namely, this is an adaptation because the information that the snake is poisonous, which deters predators, is also deters them from going for the non-poisonous snake. This is an instance of deception. That's semantic.
Well, this is really interesting because I wanted to zoom in a little bit on the reasons for this argument for counterfeit people. And one angle is really interesting I hadn't thought of before is this concept of semantic capital. So it's almost as if you think that overloading the semantic capital creates a vulnerability, just like it did with the snake mimicking the venomous snake. There's a semantic capital which can be used and deceived that we have.
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, this is an idea that goes back to my original intentional systems paper, where I said, we take out a loan of intelligence, we take out a loan of semantics, and it very valuable. It simplifies our picture of the world by orders of magnitude. But then, of course, it creates vulnerabilities. It means that we can be fooled. And if anything, the intentional stance has proven to be, as I said from the outset, a sort of instinct. It's our capacity, our proclivity to use the intentional stance to try to understand anything that's complex is well established. That's why, why around the world did Stone Age people have rain gods and sun gods and so forth? Because these were phenomena that were important to them that they couldn't understand, and so they thought, well, maybe we can pray to them, maybe we can argue with them, maybe we can make a deal. You give me rain, and I'll sacrifice a goat to you. The use of the intentional stance is such a winner, but it's also vulnerable. It's risky. You get your purchase at a price of risk.
I wanted to bring another couple of things in here. So I'm a student of the Chinese room argument, and I'm not sure we've got time to go into it into detail, but I know that you you got on board with the systems reply, which is basically thinking of, rather than a person, you think of the entire system, system understanding. And then, of course, you framed the intentional stance, which is that, we treat it as an intelligent agent capable of understanding. There is this virtual mind as well, which that it can successfully simulate the behavior of a human that understands Chinese. So it's a virtual mind and use distributed cognition. But I guess where I want to go with this, though, is that you famously kind of argued against this notion that to have true understanding, you need to have this kind of strange phenomenal consciousness that could only exist in real humans and couldn't exist in silico. And just the conversation we've had now about the black box experiment, you said that we can think of the black boxes as having mental states. So in some sense, they're agents, maybe even moral agents. And perhaps given that they are simulated human agents, we might even say that they might be moral human agents. So I guess given this, why do we designate them counterfeit if you think they're not actually counterfeit? And then the question is there a useful distinction between counterfeit people and real people?
Oh, yes. Oh, good. Well, first of all, the two black boxes, I deliberately said they're not agents. They're just boxes of truth. One of my slogans in recent years has been, we want smart machines, not artificial colleagues. Because artificial colleagues are agents in a strong sense. The boxes and the two black boxes, the only thing they can do is pump a bit string down a wire, and the other one turns on a light. Those are one-dimensional agents. We could make agents that are multidimensional. We could make agents that were autonomous, that could worry about whether we unplugged them and could decide that they wanted to preserve their own future and would try to wrest control of their on-off switches from us and so forth. Those are possible in principle, but we aren't there yet. The LLMs, for instance, are not autonomous agents. They have no morality. They are not moral agents at all, but they could be parts of future. They could be stepping stones to future artificial agents that really are autonomous.
Yes, I guess the reason for my confusion was when we adopt this intentional stance, we project goals and beliefs and so on. And it's intuitive to me that agentiveness is a continuum. And even a large language model, it could be a component in a larger architecture which can act in the real world. I think you said once on a podcast that Watson has less agentiveness than a robot.
Yes.
But to that though, does that not imply that there is a non-zero amount of agentiveness in those black boxes?
There's a non-zero amount of agentiveness in a bacteria, in a motor protein. As usual, I'm going to play the gradualist card. Yeah, sure. Somebody, I can't remember who, one of my former students or colleagues suggested that the way to think about LLMs is that, it was Keith Frankish who said this. Yeah. He said, think of them as playing the chat game. It's like playing chess. They're just trying to win the chat game. That's their only goal. And they're pretty good at it. That's a bit of attentiveness, but they don't have any other goals.
Yeah. Professor Dennett, I don't know whether you've got another few minutes. I've got another question, or if you need to go.
Go ahead.
I'll thank you so much. We'll do one on singularitarianism, which I think is quite interesting. So the AI risk debate has been ongoing since the 1960s, when Irvin John Good prophesized a potential intelligence explosion, which could leave humanity behind. And on one side are those who believe in true AI, known as the singularitarians or doomers. And on the other side are those who do not believe in true AI, known as the Church of the AI by atheists. Now, the dogma of the Singularitarians consists of three beliefs: that creation of some form of AI is likely, that humanity will be dominated or destroyed by it, and it's the responsibility of the current generation to ensure it's benign. Now, some have argued that it's implausible and it distracts from real evils, and it's a bit of an indulgence, basically. Now, this is quite interesting because when it comes to traditional religion, you are perhaps the world's most famous atheist. What's your take on singularitarianism?
First of all, I think my dear friend Richard Dawkins would be would be a better candidate for that great honor. But I certainly join him in my wholehearted atheism. I've thought, since I first heard about the singularity, that this was a dangerous distraction, because even if in some philosophical sense it's a possible in principle, it's and it may not be. I think the very idea of AGI is dubiously coherent. But even if it's possible in principle, long before we get there, non-AGIs, things which are not the singularity, may dumb us down, may exploit us, may distract us, may pollute the epistemic environment in ways that from which we can't recover. So it's like the Maginot Line. Don't plan ahead for the singularity and try to cut it off. Deal with the problems that are here right now. They're bad enough, and they don't require you to believe in the singularity.
Just in closing, a lot of these deep learning folks who believe in the singularity, they place a lot of faith in deep learning in particular, and they don't know much about some of the stuff that we're talking about around semantics and intentionality, and how meaning emerges, for example. And Searle himself said that a lot of professional philosophers don't understand these concepts well, and I believe they're very important for AI development. And some people have even commented on our Chomsky show and Gary Marcus show saying, oh, what do these guys know about AI, as if all of this semantic stuff is not relevant anymore. So do you think that deep learning folks could learn a little bit from philosophy?
Well, it depends which philosophers they listen to.
Of course.
If they listen to me, yes. But if they if they listen to Searle, they're being led down the garden path. Searle has, I think, an upside down theory of semanticity. It's right out there in the open. And David Chalmers, another one of my friendly opponents, I think his idea of the hard problem is a deep distraction. There's no hard problem. There's lots of hard questions which we're working on. But the idea that there's this hard, fast, bright line between things that have phenomenal consciousness and things that don't, that's just a theorist's illusion.
Yes.
Look, it's like vitalism, as I've been saying for years. Biologists pretty much have stopped arguing about the definition of life. Are motor proteins alive? Yeah. No, they're just proteins. Proteins aren't alive. How about viruses? Are they alive? Who cares? We understand the gradual continuum that takes you from proteins to amoebas to donkeys to people. And where you draw the line for life is not very important, because viruses, let's say, they're not alive, but boy, they evolve. If there's one thing we know, is that natural selection covers them beautifully. Right now, as we talk, you have trillions of viruses in you. Most of them, almost all of them, are doing you no harm. They're just along for the ride. Consciousness is like life. The idea that the world is divided into things that are conscious, whether it's something it's like to be them and everything else, is just a theorist's illusion, like the idea that there's a bright line between the living and the not living. So we can say, yeah, there's reactivity, there's sensitivity, there's apt use of information in a bacterium. There's lots. I mean, bacteria can be pretty darn smart. And your intelligence and your consciousness is a magnificent product of the interaction of trillions of little agents. One time I was interviewed by Giulio Giorello, a wonderful science journalist and philosopher in Italy, and the headline in the paper the next day was, Sì, abbiamo un'anima mai fatta di tanti piccoli robot. Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. Exactly. That's it. That's my motto.
Yeah.
And semanticity comes along gradually, of course, because it evolves like everything else.
I'm also a gradualist when it comes to consciousness, but Chalmers said to me in New Orleans, well, there's no consciousness meter. You can't kind of have a meter and wave it over someone's face. But we can measure consciousness in a brain using equipment. But the thing that interests me is more about this notion of conceivability. There's this other minds problem in philosophy, and Nagel spoke about what's it like to be a bat and so on. And even Chomsky talks about the limits of our human cognition. Do you think that's an issue, that we can't conceive of what it's like to be another mind?
Oh, but I think we can.
Oh, we can.
Yes. Yes. Years ago, my research associate Kathleen Akins and I set out to write a paper called What It's Like to Be a Bat. We can know everything worth knowing about what it's like to be a bat if we really set about it. It's all going to be third-person science, because that's the way science works. And the idea that there's going to be a missing ingredient is another one of those absolutist philosophical myths. Look, philosophers want to protect their territory. And the trouble is that they don't have that many tools at their disposal. What you can prove from the armchair without help from any of the sciences is pretty thin gruel. And yes, it's possible to make conceptual advances in a very rarefied conceptual environment where you don't know very much. But philosophers usually, not often, but usually end up confusing, mistaking a failure of imagination for an insight into necessity. If they knew a little bit more, they'd be able to imagine a whole lot more.
Is it one thing, though, to say that there's this impenetrable realm of the subjective experience that is completely, it eludes us entirely? And another thing just to say, okay, it really does exist. It's very, very complicated, and we simply can't conceive of it. That seems like a distinction.
Seems like one.
Amazing.
I don't think it is.
Interesting. Professor Daniel Dennett, thank you so much. I can't tell you what an honor it has been for you to come on my podcast. You're a hero of mine. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, you've asked good questions, and it's been useful talking with you. Very much so. This is what a good conversation should be.
Thank you so much.